On November 14, 2024, David Gentile walked into a federal prison to begin serving a 7-year sentence. He had been convicted by a jury on 5 counts of securities and wire fraud. More than 17,000 people had invested their money with his company. They were teachers, veterans, nurses, retirees in their 70s who had handed over everything they had saved. 12 days later, he walked out. The President of the United States set him free. This is the story of how one man built a $1.8 billion empire on a lie, and what happened when the system that was supposed to deliver justice decided his punishment was over before it had even begun. In 2013, David Gentile founded a company called GPB Capital Holdings. On paper, it looked like a legitimate private equity firm. GPB raised money from individual investors, not institutions, not hedge funds, everyday people. It pooled that money into a series of private funds, and those funds were supposed to acquire controlling interests in real businesses, car dealerships, waste management companies, cold storage facilities, solid, boring, cash-generating operations. The pitch was simple: invest with GPB, and you would receive an 8% annualized distribution, paid monthly like clockwork. And the company told investors explicitly that those payments were fully covered by the cash flow from the businesses GPB owned. 8%, guaranteed by operating income. In an era of near zero interest rates, that promise was magnetic. GPB sold its funds through a network of independent broker-dealers, more than 60 firms across the country. The marketing was handled by a company called Ascendant Capital, run by a man named Jeffrey Schneider. Schneider was the front man. He built the sales infrastructure that connected GPB to tens of thousands of retail investors who would never have found it on their own, and it worked. Between 2013 and 2018, GPB Capital raised approximately $1.8 billion. 17,000 investors put their trust in David Gentile's operation. Among them were 4,000 seniors, retirees, people who had spent decades building modest savings and were looking for a reliable return. A federal judge would later say she received hundreds of letters from victims, people in their 70s who described losing their life savings. One investor lost $450,000. Another, a woman named Caroline Tutera, invested more than $400,000. She would later describe GPB's operation in a single sentence, quote, "He basically pulled a Bernie Madoff and swindled people out of their money. But in those early years, nobody saw it. The checks arrived every month. The quarterly statements showed exactly the returns that had been promised, and the financial advisors who had recommended GPB to their clients pointed to those statements as proof that the investment was performing." It is worth pausing here to understand who these investors were. They were not Wall Street traders making calculated bets with risk capital. Many were retired school teachers, former military personnel, small business owners who had sold their companies and needed somewhere safe to put the proceeds. A nonprofit organization invested its endowment. Parents of disabled children invested money set aside for long-term care. These were people who trusted the financial system, the broker-dealers, the offering documents, the regulatory framework, to protect them from exactly the kind of scheme that GPB Capital was running. And while they waited for their monthly distributions, David Gentile was living very well. Federal filings and state attorney general investigations would later reveal how GPB spent investor capital. The company maintained private jet services, including a $90,000 a year flight attendant. Gentile personally used a 2015 Ferrari FF purchased with $355,000 of fund assets. Company records included more than $29,000 in expenses listed under the line item, David's 50th birthday. The New Jersey Office of the Attorney General documented additional personal expenditures flowing from fund assets, all-terrain vehicle rentals, luxury travel, and entertainment expenses that had no connection to the operation of car dealerships or waste management facilities. None of this was disclosed to the people whose money was paying for it. The private placement memoranda, the legal documents investors received before committing their capital, said nothing about Ferraris, private jets, or birthday parties. They said the money would go into businesses that would generate returns. Here is how the fraud worked, according to federal prosecutors. GPB told investors their monthly distributions were coming from one source: the operating cash flow of the businesses the funds owned, car dealership revenue, waste management contracts, cold storage fees, real money from real operations. That was not true. The SEC's complaint, filed in February 2021, alleged that GPB used investor capital itself to fund those distributions. Money coming in from new investors was routed to pay existing investors. It is the oldest structure in financial fraud. It is the structure of a Ponzi scheme. The private placement memoranda, the legal documents given to investors before they committed their money, stated that all distributions would be fully covered by cash flow from portfolio companies. That language was the foundation of the investment thesis, and according to the government, it was a misrepresentation from the start. But GPB did not stop at misrepresenting the source of distributions. The SEC also alleged that the company manipulated the financial statements of its funds to create the appearance that income was sufficient to cover payments. Numbers were adjusted. Reports were crafted to match the narrative. The paperwork supported a story that the underlying businesses could not. The New York Attorney General's office, which filed a separate civil action in 2021, detailed more than $50 million in undisclosed intercompany loans. Money was moved between entities without proper board approvals. Related party transactions were hidden from investors. The structural complexity of GPB's fund network served one purpose. It made the money trail harder to follow. And there was something else. The SEC complaint included an unusual charge. It alleged that GPB had placed language in employee termination agreements designed to prevent former employees from cooperating with regulators. The complaint cited violations of federal whistleblower protections and alleged retaliation against at least one known whistleblower. That detail matters, because it means that when people inside GPB tried to raise concerns, the company's response was not to investigate the problem, it was to silence the person who found it. Meanwhile, the distributions kept flowing, the investor statements kept arriving, and the marketing machine, Schneider's Ascendant Capital, kept bringing in new money. Schneider's operation reached across the country, working with more than 60 independent broker-dealer firms. These were the financial advisors sitting across the desk from retirees, explaining why GPB was a safe investment. Many of those advisors relied on the information Ascendant provided them. Some of them would later say they had no idea the returns were fabricated. The structure was designed to create distance between Gentile and the investors. The money flowed from the individual through a broker-dealer, into Ascendant's marketing pipeline, and finally into GPB's funds. Each layer added a degree of separation. Each layer made it harder for any single person to see the full picture. By 2018, GPB managed approximately $2.3 billion in assets under management. The company had expanded its fund offerings: GPB Automotive Portfolio, GPB Holdings 2, GPB Cold Storage, GPB Waste Management, and several others. Each fund was structured as a limited partnership. Each came with the same promise of 8% distributions fully covered by cash flow. But behind the numbers, the operation was beginning to crack. The businesses GPB had acquired were not generating the returns the company claimed. The gap between what was promised and what was real had been growing for years, and the only thing keeping the system alive was the continuous flow of new investor capital. In late 2018, GPB Capital announced that it would delay the release of audited financial statements for several of its funds. The company said it needed more time to finalize its accounting. It also paused new fundraising, a move that in hindsight was the first crack in the facade. A legitimate private equity firm pausing fundraising to fix its books is concerning. A Ponzi-like scheme pausing fundraising is existential. Without new money coming in, there was nothing left to pay existing investors. For the 17,000 people who had entrusted their savings to GPB, these announcements were the first visible signs that something was wrong. But inside the company, the problems were already far more advanced than anyone on the outside could see. In February 2019, the FBI conducted an unannounced visit to GPB's Manhattan offices. Federal agents arrived without warning and began collecting documents and interviewing personnel. The investigation would eventually involve the SEC, the Department of Justice, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, and securities regulators in at least 7 states, including New York, New Jersey, Alabama, Georgia, Illinois, Missouri, South Carolina, and Texas. The North American Securities Administrators Association, NASAAA, would later coordinate enforcement actions across those states. It was one of the broadest multi-state securities fraud actions in recent memory. The distribution stopped. Investors who had relied on those monthly checks, some of whom had structured their entire retirement around them, suddenly received nothing. The fund's reported values began to decline, and the 8% return that had been promised, fully covered by operating cash flow, disappeared without explanation. For many investors, the silence was worse than the losses. GPB stopped communicating. Calls went unanswered. Statements stopped arriving. The company that had once sent glossy marketing materials and quarterly performance reports simply went dark. For 2 years, the investigation unfolded quietly. Then, on February 4th, 2021, the government acted. The SEC filed a civil enforcement action, charging GPB Capital Holdings, David Gentile, Jeffrey Schneider, and others with operating a Ponzi-like scheme. The complaint alleged fraud, misrepresentation of fees and compensation, manipulation of financial statements, and violations of whistleblower protections. On the same day, the Department of Justice unsealed criminal charges. Gentile, Schneider, and a third defendant, Jeffrey Lash, a managing partner who oversaw fund investments, were charged with conspiracy to commit securities fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and securities fraud. Gentile faced 2 additional counts of wire fraud. The New York Attorney General filed a separate civil lawsuit under the Martin Act, seeking restitution and injunctive relief. An independent monitor was appointed to oversee GPB. Eventually, the court placed the company into full receivership. A federal receiver was tasked with recovering whatever assets remained and distributing them to investors. The receiver would later secure court approval to release up to $400 million to defrauded investors, a fraction of the $1.8 billion they had entrusted to Gentile's company. For the investors, this period was devastating. The distributions had stopped, the fund values were declining, and the company that had promised them steady, reliable income was now the subject of a federal fraud investigation. Many investors were retirees who depended on GPB's monthly payments to cover their living expenses. When the checks stopped arriving, some had to sell their homes. Others went back to work in their 70s. A few lost everything. The system that was supposed to protect them had failed at every level. The broker-dealers who sold the investment had not conducted adequate due diligence. The auditors who were supposed to verify GPB's financial statements had not caught the manipulation. And the regulatory bodies that were supposed to oversee private placements had taken years to act. The criminal trial took place in federal court in Brooklyn in the summer of 2024. David Gentile and Jeffrey Schneider sat as co-defendants. Jeffrey Lash, the managing partner who oversaw fund investments, was tried separately. The government presented its case over approximately 8 weeks. Prosecutors called witnesses from inside GPB's operation, compliance officers, accountants, and former employees, who described how the company's internal records told a different story than the one presented to investors. They introduced financial documents showing that the distributions investors received could not have come from operating cash flow alone. They presented internal communications that showed Gentile and Schneider were aware the numbers did not add up. The defense argued that GPB had disclosed the possibility of using investor capital for distributions in its offering documents, and that any misrepresentations were not material. Gentile's attorneys contended that the government's case relied on hindsight, that GPB's business model was legitimate even if its execution fell short. The jury was not persuaded. After approximately 5 hours of deliberation following 8 weeks of testimony, they returned guilty verdicts on every count. David Gentile, guilty of conspiracy to commit securities fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, and 2 counts of wire fraud. Jeffrey Schneider, guilty on all counts of the indictment. For the investors who had followed the trial, the verdict was a vindication. Years of uncertainty, declining fund values, and silence from the company they had entrusted with their savings. All of it was now validated by a federal jury. The system had worked. The United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York, Joseph Nasella Jr., a Trump-appointed prosecutor, issued a statement after the verdict. He said GPB Capital was built on a, quote, foundation of lies. He called the distributions a scheme that used investor capital to create the illusion of fund performance. And then he said something that would age very poorly, quote, the sentences imposed today are well-deserved and should serve as a warning to would-be fraudsters that seeking to get rich by taking advantage of investors gets you only a one-way ticket to jail. In May 2024, David Gentile was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Jeffrey Schneider received 6 years. For the 17,000 investors who had lost money, many of whom had lost everything, the sentencing was the closest thing to justice they would ever receive. On November 14, 2024, David Gentile reported to prison. 12 days later, on November 26th, he was released. President Donald Trump granted an immediate commutation of Gentile's entire sentence. The order reduced his punishment to time served. No further fines, no restitution, no probation, no conditions of any kind. The White House press secretary called the prosecution, quote, "another example of a weaponization of justice from the previous administration." The White House claimed that GPB had disclosed to investors that their capital might be used for distributions, and that the Department of Justice under President Biden had unfairly characterized this as a Ponzi scheme. Trump's clemency advocate, Alice Marie Johnson, posted on social media that she was, quote, "deeply grateful to see David Gentile heading home to his young children." There was no mention of the 17,000 investors, no mention of the 4,000 seniors, no mention of the woman who lost $450,000, or the retired teacher who described losing her savings in a letter to the judge. Jeffrey Schneider, convicted on the same charges in the same courtroom by the same jury, received no commutation. He remained in federal prison. Securities attorney Adam Ganna, whose firm represented more than 250 GPB investors, asked the obvious question, quote, "If the government wasn't able to prove their case, why not pardon David Gentile? And why is his partner still in prison?" 9 United States senators led by Arizona Democrat Ruben Gallego wrote a letter to the White House. They called the commutation, quote, "legally indefensible, morally reprehensible, and a crushing blow to the thousands of victims whose lives he destroyed." The letter noted that Gentile had served less time in prison than many Americans spend on vacation. Carol Ann Tutera, the investor who lost $400,000, described it simply, quote, "I just feel I've been betrayed." And then she said something that captured the full weight of what had happened. She said, quote, "I think it is disgusting. He basically pulled a Bernie Madoff and swindled people out of their money, and then he gets to go home to his wife and kids." Investor Mark Rosenberg, 68 years old, said, quote, "I think not only is it a betrayal, it's an injustice to the system. How did you go from you're supposed to be in prison to 2 weeks later, a swish of a pen, you're scot-free?" The New York Attorney General's civil lawsuit against GPB Capital, David Gentile, and the other defendants remains active. A federal receiver continues to manage whatever assets can be recovered. The court has approved initial distributions to investors, but the total recovered so far is a fraction of what was lost. The audit firms that worked with GPB have agreed to pay $46 million in a related settlement. The broker-dealers who sold the funds face their own wave of arbitration claims. The legal aftershocks will continue for years. Jeffrey Schneider remains in federal prison. He was convicted on the same charges in the same courtroom by the same jury. He received a 6-year sentence. No one has commuted his punishment. No one has called his prosecution a weaponization of justice. David Gentile is home with his family. The contrast between their outcomes, 2 men convicted together, 1 freed and 1 imprisoned, raises questions that no commutation order can answer. If the prosecution was unfair, it was unfair to both of them. If the evidence was insufficient, it was insufficient for both of them. And if the jury was wrong, it was wrong about both of them. But only one of them is free. There is a word that appears more than any other in the letters investors sent to the court. More than fraud, more than loss, more than betrayal. The word is trust. They trusted the financial system. They trusted the brokers who sold them the investment. They trusted the promise of 8%. They trusted that if something went wrong, the justice system would hold someone accountable. And for 12 days it did. Then it didn't. If this story stayed with you, hit like, subscribe to At The Reckoning Files 20, and turn on notifications so you never miss an investigation. New documentaries drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.